Alicia. Thanks everyone for giving me your time. Let me quickly share my screen with you. And then if you don't mind just confirming that you can see it.
Yes, we can see your screen and we can hear you, Anna. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So I think I have about 15 minutes and my topic was around ransomware or defending against ransomware. I changed it to cyber extortion really because the term ransomware is, even though it's been used in the media and everybody knows what it means, but it's actually much wider than that. It's an extortion crime. It's not just a piece of software or malware that's been used to encrypt data. And I think the previous speaker also alluded to that. So I'm going to talk about extortion crime and share a few sort of stats that we conducted in Africa. It was like a survey that we did across various African nations, as well as it's a very recent one just in South Africa. Unfortunately, it's only South African data, but I think it's still quite indicative of what's going on the continent. And then also a little bit of predictions, or sort of predictions are always, we have to take that with a pinch of salt, but about what we can expect next year. So we've done a survey that's called What Keeps You Up at Night, and I think it's no surprise here that out of all the African CISOs, similarly to the rest of the world, ransomware or extortion crime is right on top of the list of what keeps CISOs up at night, or what is sort of their biggest concern. That's followed by malware, social engineering, data breaches, etc. But I think that we can all agree that the extortion crime is really something by its sheer magnitude and increasing sort of sophistication, something that we that we need to be worried about, not just as organizations in the financial services industry, but as economies and societies as a whole. So why ransomware 2.0, or no longer just ransomware, more extortion crime, is that even though it started off with this whole malware and encrypting data and only giving it back once you pay the ransom, since December 2019 or so, they've added more extortion mechanisms to their operations, and sometimes it may not even involve the ransomware malware at all. It may just be exfiltration of data. It may just be a denial of service attack. It may be bribing of an internal person. So it's really a multifaceted or multiple extortion crime that we're looking at. And those stats here from Orange Cyber Defense, we have seen that, well, not so much in Q3, but Q2 this year, that there's definitely an increase in these sort of like non-encrypting of data extortion attacks. When we went out and we asked South African organizations, you know, like, how prepared are you in terms of defending against this threat? And we then dive into the financial services industry. I think the good news here is that compared to the average, like an average 15% of the respondents said that they don't feel they're prepared enough. But in the finance industry, that went down to only 6%. So the majority of the organizations in finance feel that they are sort of either prepared or well prepared, which I think that's in some way, that's good news. And again, no surprise, because typically, obviously, banking and financial services is where we find more of the early adopters and sort of the higher performing security sort of controls or frameworks. But then if we take that into account and we look at some of the other sectors that we are all dependent on, and that's, I think, where, if we talk about interdependence nowadays, and again, the previous speaker spoke about, you know, people working from home, something that we cannot get away from is that we can't look at these incidents in isolations or just in terms of the scope of our organizations. We all have service providers, we all have suppliers that we rely on, we all have governments that we rely on. I mean, you know, we didn't have water for the last 6 days at home. So we do rely on each other. And when those other industries, the sectors, are hit by, you know, incidents, it does affect us, whether directly or indirectly. And the concerning thing here is that particularly the government sector, or public sort of public services sector, they are not at all prepared in Africa, and they are being sought out as attractive targets, not necessarily because of, you know, like the cyber dependence that they have, but more the lack of preparedness is what these criminal gangs are being sort of made aware of. And as the more developed nations are clamping down, President Biden is declaring ransomware a national threat. As those organizations are really preparing themselves better to defend against these things, the cyber criminals will shift their attention more towards the emerging economies where we don't have the resources, we don't have the legal frameworks in place, we don't have the incident response kind of, you know, resources that you might find in America or Europe. So that's concerning, and it goes beyond just one industry sector. The core message always is that we need to find more public-private collaboration, more partnerships to defend against this threat together as African nations and industries. If we look at, you know, have you suffered a ransomware attack in the past? The financial services industry in South Africa was actually above the average rate. 39% of the respondents said yes, they had an incident before, versus the average across the board was about 32%. That's already quite a high number if we consider that's like more than a third of the organizations that confirmed in the affirmative that they've been hit with this. What's also interesting is if you look at the type of attacks, obviously because of the traditional ransomware strain was just the encryption of data, that's still the majority, so nearly 50% had encryption of data only. However, there is definitely a confirmation in the trend that there's additional extortion mechanisms being applied here. And I think particularly the banks, I mean, that's nothing new. You've been dealing with like distributed DDoS attacks for many years. But the fact that the rebels and the contis of the cybercrime world are adding these features onto the stack of attack abilities, or the operators, ransomware operators are offering, that makes it even more concerning. Or that had fallen victim to this before. 4% of, well, obviously the majority, like nearly 80% said, well, they recovered somehow using internal resources or from backups. 18% didn't know, but 4% confirmed that they actually paid the ransom. And now one might think 4%, well, is that a lot? Well, it is actually a hell of a lot, particularly if we compare this with any legitimate direct marketing business, where a 4% return rate is considered really sort of high success. And this explains why this type of crime, and it's a crime, it's not just a cyber malware problem, we're dealing with a criminal problem here, is so lucrative and is growing as it is growing. In terms of the root causes, and this is really the initial foothold, like how does the that you have like these different groups. You've got the operators who write the software and control the infrastructure, and then they work with affiliates, which are like franchisee type organizations that sort of do some of the work, and then they split the proceeds. A lot of the initial sort of infection or the initial foothold into the environment is done through a couple of basic mechanisms that you would find in any other data breach as well. Predominantly social engineering is still here, and one of the number one reasons of how the malware got in. That's followed by unpatched software or sort of weaknesses, vulnerabilities. Often Microsoft RDP would also be, it's one of the hot sort of ways of getting in. So misconfiguration and password issues or stolen credentials. Once they're in the environment, by either using any of these initial entry channels, they would then try and laterally move in the environment. Sometimes they sit there for months to try and understand what's going on, and then only do the exploitation, and that could be through exfiltration of data, encrypting of data, destroying the backups, etc., and then ultimately start the negotiation for the ransom amount. the message here really is that if we look at the initial intrusion, and those are very basic things to I mean, I'm not saying that the prevention is the only thing, like we have to work with, you know, like the whole sort of NIST framework from initial prevention, detection, etc., recovery, but we should really focus on making sure that this the initial foothold is not happening by locking down our internet accessible devices, by focusing on security culture and sort of addressing the social engineering problem, obviously locking down passwords. Again, the previous speaker mentioned MFA, definitely. So it makes sense to really get back to basics and lock down the environment as much as possible. In terms of the predictions for next year, what I've heard is that because it's so profitable, there will be more and additional extortion tactics that the gangs are going to add. They may also, because they're now becoming more business savvy, sort of add in higher fees. So we expect to see higher ransom demands. Something that was also interesting is that because of the variety of the different groups working together, that we might see or may see more conflict amongst these criminal gangs, that will then ultimately result again in like a disadvantage on the victim side. So you may find somebody paying, but because the affiliate isn't happy with the operator or with whatever the cut that they're getting, they may then still release the data even though the victim has paid. We will see more focus on sort of low-hanging fruits. Definitely, Africa public sector is amongst those, unfortunately. More attention also on the sort of OT environments. And then, yeah, there's also a sort of a use of state-sponsored operations or malware that has been developed for and by nation states that's leaking out into the sort of the underground that's being used by these operators. And we're really dealing with highly organized criminal members really that are not fly-by-nights. They're organized and they're in it for the long haul. So we just need to brace ourselves, I guess. And if we apply something from the criminology field called the routine activity theory, and look at it not as a malware or a cyber sort of tech problem only, but a crime problem, then there's three sort of occurrences or three states that if they occur, it's very likely for crime to happen. And firstly, you need a motivated offender, which we do have. We have the ransomware groups who some claim, I think Rebel claimed they made over $100 million in 2020. So definitely there's motivation there, but how can we demotivate them? So are there ways of following the money? Are there ways of putting restrictions in place on the cryptocurrency? How can we work across jurisdictions better? The second thing that needs to be in place is sort of an attractive victim. So the less prepared the victim organization is, the less controls they have in place, obviously the easier it is. Again, there the focus needs to be on making sure we have all our basic controls in place, that we lock down as much as possible to make ourselves as less attractive as possible. And then thirdly, what needs to be in place to make crime happening is a lack of sort of guardianship. And that's where the whole collaboration comes in place. Like if we can work together more, similarly to like a neighborhood watch, where you have organization security teams working with law enforcement, with national response, with the security providers. And I know that there are grassroots like initiatives already in place. At least I've been seeing that in South Africa. And maybe we can extend that across sort of multiple African nations to really try and tackle this together. One thing in terms of collaboration that we did between Orange Cyber Defense, KnowBe4, and the South African Cybersecurity Hub is we actually created a more targeted towards the public sector, but it's really useful for anyone, is sort of a guide on how to set up an effective defense against cyber extortion. This is available for free. I'm very happy to share the link as well on the chat later on. It's written in Africa for Africans, and sort of just best practices really. There's a couple of other good resources that I've listed here, and I think I'm 14 minutes in, so yeah, thank you so much for the time and for your attention today. In summary, you know, this is not going to go away. Cyber extortion is sort of the biggest problem, I would say, in the digital space at the moment. It's not a tech problem, it's a crime problem, and that's how we need to look at it. And in order to defend ourselves, we have to do more on the collaboration side and partnering across industries and nations as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. So do you think cybercrime has become a pandemic in itself?
Oh yes, definitely.
And how much do you think the onus is on governments to reduce the impact? Or do you think it's each one for themselves, find a system to save yourself?
No, I mean, definitely, like that's what I mentioned, the partnership, the collaborative effort is needed here. We unfortunately don't have the type of government resources that you might find in the States. I mean, I can talk for South Africa again, you know, like our National Cyber Hub has 3 people working there, so it's not the same. But that makes it even more so important that we work together. And again, that's where I look at the banks and the financial services industry, where they have you know, they've got existing security teams. Standard Bank has like a team of 300 people just in security, you know, so there's a lot of skill and knowledge and expertise available that, yes, obviously it's focused on protecting the bank most and foremost, but are there not ways that we can sort of leverage off the existing expertise, work together with government to help them defend themselves, as well as other sectors as well?
Let's hope that collaboration comes to, Anna, because earlier in the day, we've heard of the need for collaboration, for sharing of data, for better compliance, and for you know, reducing risk of fraud also. Thank you so much, Anna, for joining us today and sensitizing everyone about the problem of cyber extortion. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.